Amid U.S. President Donald Trump's threats to annex Canada, the focus has turned to our water supply. BC's energy minister has said the province cannot use its water supply as a bargaining chip because of the Columbia River Treaty.
So what exactly is the Columbia River Treaty? When Grand Coulee Dam opened in 1942, the dam quickly became the largest hydropower station in the world, kind of by accident. The dam was originally built as an irrigation project, and the power stations came in handy during World War II. But once everything was operational, they quickly realized that these power stations weren't nearly big enough. Measured at the US-Canada border, they discovered that the Columbia could get as low as only 14,000 cubic feet per second during the dry season, followed by an astonishing 500,000 cubic feet per second during spring runoff. And so the thought process was that if you could get those two numbers closer together, you can make Grand Coulee and every other dam on the river into a much larger and more efficient producer of power, which is what led to the Columbia River Treaty of 1961. The concept of the treaty is pretty straightforward. Canada would build 3 new large storage dams in the Rockies to hold back excess spring runoff and then release it gradually throughout the year. Canada would build Kinleyside Dam, the almost 800-foot tall Mica Dam, and the Duncan Dam with a whole lot of mountain storage. In exchange for building those 3 dams, Canada is entitled to 50% of the extra energy generated in the US. This is referred to in the treaty as the Canadian entitlement. Canada didn't actually need all that surplus electricity in the 60s and 70s, and so they immediately sold their Canadian entitlement back to the US for cash to help pay for the building of those dams. This turned out to be a very good deal for both countries. Canada received the means to be able to modernize the river infrastructure and enough energy to last them for a very long time. The US also benefited from all this increased power production, but also was able to spread out the load of flood control across a larger series of dams, which is a big reason why the Portland-Vancouver area hasn't experienced a truly catastrophic flood since 1948. The treaty was first signed in 1961 and requires either side to give 10 years notice if they want to opt out of the agreement completely. Now, the treaty doesn't really expire per se, but the cash for flood control agreement did go away in 2024, which means that for the last several years, the US and Canadian governments have been at the table trying to negotiate a practical extension of the existing agreement. No one wants this treaty to go away. It's actually very favorable for both parties. In the last months of the Biden administration, the two sides came to a general understanding, a framework handshake deal of what was going to be ratified by both governments. But they never actually signed the extension. There's really no reason to panic right this second about negative consequences from this treaty getting delayed. It just means that changes to the agreement are on pause, and so the most likely scenario is that for now, things will continue to operate as they have in years past. But for the long-term security of energy and flood control in the Pacific Northwest, we need to get this agreement signed. There's really no upside to dragging this out for a moment longer. So what exactly was in the deal for the Columbia River Treaty that was just scrapped by the White House? We don't actually know for sure. All of this is done behind closed doors, but there's been several reports that a general understanding was reached by both parties that had some minor adjustments to the existing 50-year agreement. Canada is still going to store excess water, and the US is still going to generate a ton of hydropower and make some of it available to Canada. But the original agreement called for a 50-50 split of that surplus energy, either sent as actual power or paid for in cash. The rumors that we heard about this agreement was that the total amount of power sharing was going to come down by some percentage. And in exchange, Canada would be responsible for less of the flood control. Now, the truth is, we probably have enough ample flood control just in the United States to handle most 100-year floods, but the agreement did supposedly allow for the United States to call on Canada to ask for additional storage if needed, presumably for some sort of fee. Again, all of this is rumor. So what would be the practical implications if this plan went forward? The short answer is not much. Lake Roosevelt would likely be operated a little bit lower during certain parts of the season. This additional flood control storage in Lake Roosevelt would mean slightly less power produced at Grand Coulee during this time period. These lower reservoir levels might affect power output at certain times of the year. Also, if the United States has to absorb more of the flood control responsibility, then at certain times of the year, the lower Columbia might have swifter currents than are normally expected, which could be disruptive to river traffic downstream near the ports. Now again, all of this is speculative, and we don't know if any of these negative consequences would actually play out. The Columbia River has been operating within a very generous margin of error for many decades. Pulling back on some of the flood control probably isn't going to be the end of the world. And sending less power to Canada should be a net win for wholesale power prices here in the US. All in all, it sounds like it was a pretty good framework of a deal. There's a lot of ways that the Columbia River Treaty could go off the rails and be weaponized against the interests of having working rivers. Let's hope that never happens. So what is the White House hoping to gain by pausing negotiations on the Columbia River Treaty? Honestly, I can't think of anything. The Columbia River Treaty was born out of a desire to protect our cities from floods using the infrastructure that helps us generate power. When those two interests align, we are maximizing the value for both nations, and everybody downstream and upstream benefits. The biggest winner is the city of Portland, which used to flood quite regularly. So much of the quality of life and the industries that support it are related to the working rivers. Nobody wins if that stability goes away. The next winners are the people of the Pacific Northwest, both US and Canadian. For those of us who grew up in this region, we become spoiled by having this amount of clean, reliable, and inexpensive energy. If you live anywhere else in the US, most of your power comes from fossil fuels. This means reduced air quality, worse water quality, and of course, a much larger contribution to global climate change. Now, we all know that our 47th president has an obsession with getting water out of Canada and into Southern California. The Columbia River Treaty in no way enables that. Let's just do a thought experiment. Let's say that 47 was able to completely renegotiate the deal and basically take control of 100% of the water. Let's say that everything went to the United States, Canada got nothing, and the US now has full control of everything, no stops, no qualifications. It is 800 some miles from the Columbia River to the city of Los Angeles. And even the shortest possible path, which would be a canal from the Umatilla area down to the area around Mount Shasta, is still around 400 miles. There is no scenario in our lifetimes where moving water that distance over mountains and deserts and canyons makes any kind of economic sense. And the sooner that some advisor can let the White House know this, the better.